Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all in our panel discussion, Ways to Weather Compounding and Cascading Climate Security Risks. Please note that this session is being recorded. My name is Barbara Shidova. I'm a researcher at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, studying the climate and conflict dynamics and the project lead of the Weathering Risk Initiative. I will be the moderator of today's session. Before we start, I would like to ask the audience to use the chat function or the Q&A function or raise their hand if they want to pose a question to any of our speakers, and please feel free to do so at any point in time during our panel discussion. I would also like to invite our panelists to ask each other questions during the discussion. And just to keep the track of time, I would like to directly start by introducing to you our excellent panelists. So the first would be Kemp, Dr. Luke Kemp, who is a research associate at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk and Darwin College at the University of Cambridge. He holds both a doctorate in international relations and a Bachelor of Interdisciplinary Studies with first-class honors from the Australian National University. Luke is currently writing a book on societal collapse and transformation, which will be published in 2023. He will kick off our session with a presentation of his recently published paper, Climate Endgame. So welcome, Luke. The second one on our panel is Dr. Franziska Gaub, who is a food system scientist and senior gast researcher at PIC. Franziska is interested in food system economics and systemic risks modeling. Additionally, she has experience in system analysis using quantitative and qualitative methods to foster transformative change towards a resilient future. She holds a doctoral degree from the University of Oxford and a master's degree in ecological economics from the University of Edinburgh. The next on the panel is Professor Nina von Uxküll, who is an associate professor of peace and conflict research at Uppsala University in Sweden and an associate senior researcher at the PRIO Institute in Oslo. She has for over 10 years contributed to research on the impacts of climate change and natural hazards on armed conflict and human security. Her work has been published in leading academic journals, including PNAS, Journal of Politics, Nature, and Journal of Conflict Resolution. She has advised and worked with stakeholders such as the World Bank, Norwegian Red Cross, FAO, and the European Commission. She currently leads the project Petroleum Prices and Protests, the Impact of Climate Change Mitigation on Social Unrest, funded by the Swedish Research Council. And last but not least, Desigen Naido is our final panelist, who is Climate Risk and Human Security Lead at the Institute for Security Studies and Climate Adaptation Lead in Presidential Climate Commission. He is also a president of the global NGO Human Right to Water and a founding member of the Water Policy Group. He was previously the CEO of the Water Research Commission in South Africa and served in senior positions in the South African national government and universities. He is a counselor of the South African National Advisory Council on Innovation and a fellow of the Manangove Institute for Strategic Reflections. So welcome, Desigen, as well. And so once again, warm welcome to all of you. And now I would like to invite Luke to kick off our session with his presentation. We are looking forward to it. Luke, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Barbara. I will briefly share my screen. So today I'll be speaking to you about a paper recently published in August of this year called Climate Endgame, Exploring Catastrophic Climate Change Scenarios. It was published in PNAS with both the current head of PIC, Johan Rockström, as well as the previous head of PIC, John Steinhuber, amongst several others. In this paper, we don't try to directly say that climate change is going to result in a catastrophe. Instead, what we do is we provide reasons that such scenarios are plausible. We provide a rationale as to why they need to be explored. And we also sketch out an approach to how we can explore these kind of worst case climate risks. And while this was a team effort, I take sole responsibility for any poor humor or memes used throughout the presentation. In 1988, at the Toronto conference, climate change was called a risk that was second only to global nuclear war. In August of this year, there was a modeling study published in Nature Food, which suggested that the impacts of nuclear war could lead to 5 billion casualties in the long term. That's if you have a full exchange between the US and Russia. Could climate change get close to that in the very long term? In short, just how bad could climate change get? The general response to this is either naive dismissal, that most integrated assessment models suggest we're going to lose a couple of percentage points of GDP. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have, oh, my video appears to have gone off.
Yeah, look, we also don't hear you super well.
Yeah,
Okay.
I turned off your video to save some bandwidth because we would like to hear your presentation. Maybe you can keep it turned off to see if the quality improves.
Maybe it also is, you know, dependent on whether you have the headphones in or not. I'm not sure.
The headphones are usually better than the normal versions.
Okay.
I'll stick with these.
But now it sounds better, so great.
Okay. So just how bad could climate change get? As mentioned, this ranges from naive dismissal, integrated assessment models suggest we're only going to lose a few percentage points, all the way through to climate doomerism. This is inevitable and the collapse is forthcoming. Now, we need a much more sophisticated approach. And this needs to think about not just simply temperature rise, but a number of other factors. So of course, we do need to think about anthropogenic emissions. We need to think about the full range from kind of low to high emission scenarios. We also need to think about Earth system responses, not just the climate system, but broader Earth systems. We also need to, of course, think about climate change impacts. Societal fragility, so how risk is cascades, and how vulnerable different systems are to cascading climate risks. And of course, last but not least, the international and domestic responses of different communities, which could either alleviate or aggravate the initial impacts and risks. It is worth noting here that climate risk or extreme climate risks are understudied. Most assessment of impacts tend to take an approach where we simply tally up individual hazards, such as sea level rise, extreme weather events, etc. There are very few which do compound risk assessment, and even fewer which look at potential risk cascades and the damages they can result in. Even when we just zoom into temperature rise and anthropogenic emissions, it appears that we are understudying the extreme scenarios relative to the probability. This is drawn from two exercises that I participated in, which essentially did text mining of IPCC reports. These were led by Florian Yen at the University of Gießen and published in both Environmental Research Letters and Earth's Future. Now, what we show here is that the coverage of basically anything above 3 degrees Celsius, and these are mentions in IPCC reports, is drastically understudied relative to the probability, as well as relative to higher to lower temperature scenarios, such as 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. Importantly, this has also increased over time. Now, when you look at different IPCC assessment reports, there's been a trend towards covering lower warming scenarios relative to higher ones. Why is this the case? I believe there are several reasons. First, the goals of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement have channeled scientific attention towards 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. Second, it's simply harder to do. Once we start thinking about 5 or 6 degrees Celsius, it is so displaced from the current climate niche that we need to draw more upon things like geological studies. And of course, a complex risk assessment of risk cascades, for instance, is more realistic, but it's also much more difficult to perform. Third is, as Michael Oppenheimer and colleagues suggested, there is an incentive for climate scientists and scholars to err on the side of least drama. actions by the merchants of doubt over many decades have created a disincentive to talk about extreme scenarios, since this could be easily misconstrued as alarmism. And this is all compounded by the consensus procedures of the IPCC. Where are we now? So if we look at simply current policies, the climate action tracker suggests we're on a path to roughly 2.7 degrees Celsius. And that's the median. If you look at a kind of wider array, then it's roughly 2.1 to 3.9 based upon current policies. But of course, there is a long tail and a great deal of uncertainty, both in terms of Earth system responses, but also in terms of what the future energy systems look like. It's worthwhile always having a grain of salt when it comes to projections. I do a lot of work into foresight, and when it comes to making estimates about future geopolitical events, the best approach we have is what are called super forecasters. And there's no sign that they are accurate more than a year out. So estimates of what the energy system looks like by 2100, we should take with a great deal of uncertainty. So why should we explore extreme climate risks? First is risk management. When we look at different approaches to robust decision-making under uncertainty, they usually require knowledge of the worst-case scenario. One example of this is the mini-max principle, which is a common tool which ranks different policy options by their plausible worst cases. Second is the implications for modeling and analysis. If you include tipping points in an integrated assessment model, you can increase the social cost of carbon by 8-fold. If you include a wider set of different temperature rises, then you potentially increase the social cost of carbon by orders of magnitude. It can also help to galvanize action. In 1983, Carl Sagan and colleagues published a paper which put forward the idea of nuclear winter. And the notion of a nuclear winter mechanism and evidence for it helped to galvanize both multilateralism as well as bottom-up disarmament efforts. Last but not least is to inform interventions. None of this is about disaster voyeurism. Instead, it's about informing our interventions in both resilience and adaptation, particularly when it comes to the worst-case scenarios. It can also be useful in thinking through emergency responses, such as stratospheric aerosol injection, pumping up particles into the atmosphere, which reflect sunlight. This means we need to have an understanding of the extreme risks of both climate change and the emergency options. This diagram here is based upon work published by myself and Dr. Aaron Tang at the Australian National University, where we tried to look at what do we know about the extreme risks of stratospheric aerosol injection. And in short, not much, and much of it depends on how it's deployed and how much is deployed. The one thing we can say is that there is always this risk of termination shock. And what this means is that potentially you shift the risk distribution, where the average outcome under geoengineering is better, but the worst case scenario is potentially worse than warming you're offsetting. Are catastrophic climate change scenarios plausible? Is any of this really even worth thinking about? We say yes, for 4 different reasons. First of all, humans are adapted to a very particular climatic niche. This is based upon work by Zucchi and colleagues, which puts forward that human population density has been clustered around a climatic envelope of roughly 13 degrees mean annual temperature. And we don't know how easily we can move outside that climate niche. It's also worth noting here that climate change has, of course, been implicated in all of the 5 mass extinction events throughout the Paleozoic history of Earth. Second is systemic risk, that the different diffuse impacts of climate change combined with the structure of the global system could lead to system-wide failures. Of particular note here is the overlap between extreme warming in the future and population. So we did a bit of modeling here, which looks at SSP 3.7, so a medium to high emission scenario, which results in warming of 2.8 to 3.2 degrees Celsius by 2017. And what we've mapped out here in the shaded areas is mean annual temperature above 29 degrees Celsius, a temperature which only impacts roughly 20 million people a day, primarily in the Sahara Desert without built-up infrastructure. By 2070, this could cover roughly 2 billion people. climate change could also exacerbate or trigger other extreme risks. So what we do here is we try to, once again, take this notion of extreme heat and map it against both state fragility as well as other proxies for catastrophic risks, such as BS4 facilities, biosafety level 4, which deal with the most dangerous pathogens in the world, and nuclear armed states. And what we see is there's a very clear overlap between the most fragile states and extreme warming in the future, but it also impacts 7 different BS4 facilities and 2 different nuclear powers, India and Pakistan. There's also latent risk that climate change may impede our ability to recover from another global catastrophe, such as nuclear war, or even more speculatively, something like a zombie apocalypse. I always dislike that you can't hear laughter on Zoom. I'm just going to assume people are laughing. Another thing we do in this paper is try to provide definitions for discussing catastrophic climate change. Something that has hindered the debate is that there are no clear definitions that people have when they say things like climate change is an existential risk, for instance. So what we try to do here is provide a range of different definitions that can help to provide a shared language and lexicon. I won't go into depth here, but one thing that is worth noting is that the way we try to speak about climate change and risk is not as climate change as an individual hazard, but rather as a contributor to an overall level of global catastrophic risk. So rather than asking, will climate change be a global catastrophe or will it cause human extinction, we should ask, what is its contribution under a particular scenario to the overall level of global catastrophic or extinction risk? It's definitely a less sexy way to talk, but much more accurate and realistic. And we also put forward a research agenda for studying this. We put forward the idea of exploring extreme Earth system states, so what the Earth system looks like in the very long term under different levels of extreme warming, how to model mass mortality and morbidity, including through existing models such as integrated assessment models, understanding societal fragility, so doing risk assessments, which include things like vulnerability, risk cascades, and integrated climate catastrophe assessments. Basically bring together the results of the previous 3 strands and using things like expert elicitation, Bayesian networks, etc., to try to think through how could climate change contribute to an overall level of risk in different scenarios. And ideally, this would include very particular standardized scenarios where we consider things like certain levels of inequality and different levels of dangerous technologies being deployed. A brief word on compounding and cascading risks. Under the 3rd research strand, we really need to think about risk cascades, both in terms of dominoes and spirals, the difference there being a spiral being a reinforcing feedback loop and a domino not being. We also, of course, need to think beyond extreme weather towards things like sea level rise. Even the very slow pernicious effects can cause risk cascades and interactions with other extreme risks. It's worth noting here that some areas which seem to be plausible risks are heavily understudied, such as the collapse of the reinsurance industry. And of course, the interaction of climate change and its impacts with other vulnerabilities. All of these risks will, of course, be compounded by tipping points.
Look, just in interest of time, I think it would be great if you could
slowly conclude. Yep, I can finish up with this one then. And the last thing we do is essentially put forward a call for an IPCC session report on catastrophic climate change. And one last note is that talking about these extreme risks is not bad messaging. Hope versus fear is a false dichotomy. Meta-analyses of hope versus fearful messaging have mixed results. And we have a much more robust literature system that choosing the right frame messages is more important. And ultimately, we should be thinking about doing honest risk assessments and suggesting what can be done. I'll finish there.
Thank you so much for the excellent summary of your work and of your climate endgame paper, which, among other things, concludes that it is essential that prudent risk management under uncertainty accounts for the worst case consequences of climate change. In other words, that we need to prepare for the climate endgame and societal collapse in this context. This includes preparing for the risk cascades and systemic risks that extreme climate impacts could trigger. Because Luke has to unfortunately leave our panel quite soon, I would like to start and open the discussion by posing a question to him. So Luke, your paper has received a lot of publicity, but also met some criticism on different grounds, among other things for being too alarmist. So I was wondering, what is your take on this critique? And I mean, you touched upon this already a little bit, but could you, in the context of the criticism, emphasize again, why do we need studies like yours, looking at the catastrophic questions?
So interestingly, I was actually surprised that there wasn't more pushback on this paper. I was expecting much more critique. Most of the responses we've had have been quite positive. When you look at, for instance, responses on science media communications, most people agree with the very essential premises of the paper, that these risks are underexplored and it's vital to assess them. The few bits of pushback we have gotten have usually, for instance, been around whether these risks are underexplored. There was a recent reply letter by Burgess et al., which suggests that when you look at RCP 8.5 and its coverage in IPCC reports, it's actually fairly well covered. Our response to that is that RCP 8.5 covers a range of different temperature scenarios, and it's not a proxy for extreme risk assessment. As I noted, extreme risk assessment isn't just about temperature, it's also about suicidal fragility, risk cascades, etc. And importantly, all the other lines of evidence suggest this isn't the case. So our more refined text mining reports, for instance, suggest that these scenarios are underexplored. And this is also echoed by literature sampling we did in Google Scholar, and also reinforced by popular accounts by popular science writers who try to look at the impacts, people like Mark Linus and David Wallace-Wells, who all note that when you get to 5 and 6 degrees, there's just a dearth of literature in comparison to 1.5 and 2 degrees. But apart from that, I think most of the scholarly community appears to really agree with the idea that, yes, these risks are plausible and we need to study them. And of course, our paper is not saying they're likely, but prudent risk management requires thinking about them.
Thank you so much. Do other panelists still have a question that they would like to pose to Luke, because we only have 4 minutes left? If this is not the case, oh, Desi, yeah, please feel free to pose a question.
It's not a question, it's a comment, if I may. And maybe add a little bit to the criticism of the strategy. I mean, the crux is that you want to influence decision making. And many parts of the world and many communities of practice have tried for quite a while around using this extreme caricature type scenarios. And there are a bunch of things that have come out of that says that maybe one should rethink it. I mean, one is that it sometimes in many places creates a paralysis. You know, it's kind of a doomsday paralysis where you can't really feel sufficiently empowered to actually engage something around it. Secondly, it becomes far too vulnerable to challenge. And we've seen this actually with previous IPCC reports, where the fossil fuel lobby, which is pretty vigilant, looks for those flaws in exaggerated science and uses that to discredit the much larger thesis around it. And I think that really is worth considering. And then there's the issue about even when the people who are convinced about this, and here I would use an example of the European Union, when push comes to shove and very quick, large decisions are made around current quality of life issues, you see dramatic shifts in that decision-making in the opposite direction. I mean, the case in point is the energy crisis precipitated on the back of the events in the Ukraine. And the switch of many European countries were leading in the Green Deal phenomenon around the world, switching to fossil fuel as the rescue point for energy security. So maybe Luke wants to react to those. I'm sure he's heard it all before.
Yeah, Luke, please go.
Yeah, I'll offer a very brief response. So I think these are all valid criticisms, as you mentioned, ones which we have come across before. In terms of paralysis, it's an understandable concern, but there's not really any good evidence that this is the case. So once again, when you look at the literature around this, there's very few which suggest that talking about risk is going to lead to people freezing up. Indeed, one of the few studies is often paraded as being an example of this actually has worry over climate change as being the biggest predictor of increased support for climate policy. I do agree that there's obviously huge problems in trying to influence policymakers, but this is something we have for essentially all climate research, not just looking at extreme risks. And in terms of the fossil fuel lobby using any kind of small coverage of extreme risk to try to brand it as alarmism, I mean, I feel like it's giving into them that we basically say, fine, we'll cover extreme risk because you're going to run a PR strategy against us. And I think it's also notable that no matter what is done, that's going to be the case. And I think we're much better trying to fight back against the merchants of doubt rather than trying to get into them.
Thanks.
And with that, I'll have to head off, unfortunately.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks a lot for your contribution to our session. Now I would like to turn to the other panelists. Maybe we can start with Nina, and I would like to ask if you take a climate security lens, would you agree with Luke about the importance of understanding such worst case scenarios for policy and programming?
Thanks a lot for the question. I think this was this is a very important paper. I think it brings to, I mean, it really put the emphasis on low probability, enormous impacts that climate change may have. And I also agree with the statement that we know quite little, especially about security implications, given that all the studies we have so far are really studies on the past decades, on the past maybe centuries, but are not really taking into account the future and potential catastrophic futures as well. So just moving the focus towards the future and pointing towards knowledge gaps is, I think, is an important move.
Thanks, Nina. Maybe Franziska, you would also like to share your insights on this with us?
Yeah, sure. So I think in general, it's definitely always worth from a research perspective to explore the lower risk boundaries, which we do with the 1.5 degree scenarios, and the upper risk boundaries. And I think Luke's paper says that we're currently on the trajectory to a 3.9 degree warming or even explore higher risk scenarios. And while this is from a research perspective, interesting idea for sure, I think from my opinion as a risk modeler, it's even more interesting or urgent to pay more attention to the impacts of those systemic risks that Luke is also talking about. So the compound events, the positive feedback mechanism, the tipping points and those impacts. And yeah, Luke mentions those in the paper as well. And for example, the better understanding of extreme climate dynamics or the investigating social aspects like vulnerabilities and cascading effects. And I think that those systemic risk aspects are still absent in many pathways and analyses. And I think this is actually the more urgent problem rather than exploring human extinction. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. And maybe this again, I'm not sure if you want to still contribute to this question, or you're muted. And now I turned off my camera.
Yeah, I would, if you don't mind. I needed to tag Luke. I mean, couldn't let him go away without a challenge. But here's my view on this generally. I mean, one is that it is astounding in 2022 what I think a majority of decision makers find themselves in the space of still considering climate change issues and environmental risk. And when you have these discussions, and I have several of them in the African space and more generally in the developing country space, and also with lots of North American colleagues, there is still a body of people, of very powerful people that say, okay, we hear this, but our environmental people are engaging this issue. So computing the equations that make it very clear that when the risks cascade as they already are doing. And I live in a part of the world that has had extreme weather events for the better part of 2 decades now. And how this compounds around the things that are closest to people, like economics and security. It's only then that you start having the right kind of conversations around decision making. I mean, already we have seen how powerful the impact has been of 2 events that have been driven by Africans, one outside the continent and one inside the continent. And I'm talking about the African conversation around climate change. One is Africa's own positioning in the UN Security Council around trying to get a resolution in around recognizing climate risk as a major security factor. The resolution didn't pass. There were many important reasons for that, but it really heightened the discussion and who was having the discussion on the African continent. The second is an internal occurrence, and that was the AU, Peace and Security Council, which is, I think, by far the most powerful organ inside the AU. It met in November last year under the banner of the Climate Development and Security Nexus. You know, this was driven in large part by the coups, the recent coups, including at that time the latest one in Mali. Now, of course, we have another in Burkina Faso. And because of where the discussion happened, and because the equation was now a lot clearer around the relationship between the climate issues and the resource scarcity and the tribal conflicts and extremism, violent extremism, unconstitutional change of government, a very different set of people, more powerful decision makers, if you like, started getting into that conversation. And you are seeing the fruits of that. So the 2022 Outlook report from the African Development Bank is by and large a climate change report. And you can see how powerful it becomes when you start organizing for the expression of risk in a way that affects what the core agendas are of the different decision-making communities. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. So, so my takeaway is that from a scientific perspective, it's really, as Franziska suggested, interesting or important actually also for policymaking to look at the systemic risks and to touch upon them. And this can have very productive implications for the policy discussions and programming and who engages, and could attract even attention of the more powerful decision makers. So now I would like to turn to the scientists in our panel, so to Nina and Franziska, and I would like to ask them, where do we currently stand in this regard? So how far do we understand the compounding and cascading risks, and what priorities emerge in this regard for the scientific work? So I'm not sure who would like to start. Maybe Nina, I can invite you direct.
Thanks a lot. So yeah, that's an important question. I think, as I already touched upon, the literature on climate change and security has been expanding rapidly over the 10-15 years, but of course this literature relies on data, and data comes from the past decades, comes from the past centuries. And I think this is one reason for why this question is important. Maybe it's important to note there that generally the overall finding is that climate doesn't have a major role for causing conflict. So overall, there are relationships, but overall, if we compare to other drivers of conflicts, then the relationship is a rather minor one. It's a contributor to conflict. But, and I think that's also important to have in mind, and that was emphasized, for example, in an expert elicitation published 2019 in Nature, that was also referenced by Luke. As we move into the future, a lot of the impacts will increase, a lot of the impact of climate change on food security, on the economy, and will increase. So I think there's a general fear among scientists that what we have studied so far will maybe not match what we see in the future. And I think if we look into what he has pointed out there, that's an assessment that's as far as we have gotten here. So there's very few projections of the future, very few attempts to look into what actually might happen in the future. So, but a general perception that the risk will increase. What is also important to note here, you asked about compounding effects. is that I think we see now that we need to emphasize in this debate also the fragility and conflict as a driver of vulnerability. He partly did that as well, and we did that in other papers too, kind of accepting that climate change will have effects in areas that are already affected by conflict, and will have stronger effects in these areas where several risks and climate risk and security risks are compounding. So I think that's an important point that he touched upon. But maybe one general remark on the science is that we look into the literature, we're quite bad at taking into account cascading and simultaneous effects. I think there's a lot of literature trying to isolate the climate or the drought or the flood or the impacts in the short term, because it's something that is easier to do from a research design perspective, to just isolate short term, what is the effect here. But science so far has been quite bad at looking into simultaneous impacts through various drivers of conflict. And I think that's where also the points on research agenda on future research are important to that he made, and that I think we also made in other publications, that this is something we need to do more and really get into the systemic risks.
Thanks a ton. Franziska, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, so maybe I would speak from my food system perspective. From the research side, I would say in my field over the last years, there has been increasing attention to the topic of compound risk, for example, compounding drought and heat wave risk and how they interact. So there has been a lot of research using copulas as statistical methods to look at dependent structures. Hazards can also compound over space and time. So there has been a lot of research recently on the effects of ENSO, El Niño Southern Oscillation, on the spatially compound crop failures, risk of multiple breadbasket failures, or over time recurring hazards that decrease the coping capacity of the population. And in regard to the topic of cascading risk, I would also say that they have received increasing attention in research in my field. And they do not only address hazards, but specifically also vulnerability and exposure to risk. So that means from the research perspective, it's not just the climate modelers in their journals, but it's really an interdisciplinary effort, because it combines climate hazards with topics maybe in the social sciences around resilience, vulnerability. And so I think we need more interdisciplinary collaboration, and also be more open in our research methods, because there's still sometimes a bit debate or not perfect collaboration between the natural scientists and the social scientists. And from the policy side, I would say I've been involved in the past 2 UN global risk assessments, GAR 19 and GAR 22. And there it's really great to see that disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management, I would say, has seen a shift in perspective as well, like away from the focus on siloed hazards towards integrated risk management, also looking at systemic risk, vulnerabilities, societal resilience. And I think from my perspective, the biggest challenge is the topic of systemic risk governance. How do we manage risk across scales, across disciplines? How can we bring together health, agriculture, infrastructure, finance experts, and how can we govern those complex risks?
Thanks a ton. So we have received some very valuable insights on what the priorities from a research perspective are. So for instance, in the climate security scene, apparently there hasn't been much done in the direction of cascading and compounding risks and simultaneous impacts on the conflict drivers. So this would be one priority, as Nina mentioned, and also to look into the future. But also we see some positive developments in the food system perspective or in the food system research, as there have been some, or there is growing, inputs and research on compounding and cascading risks. We also see more interdisciplinary efforts, which is great. Now I would like to ask also Desigan what he from practitioner's perspective, would wish for, you know, scientific work to engage more with? Like, what kind of insights would you like to get from scientists so that we can more effectively address systemic risks, compounding risks, and risk cascades?
Okay, look, having been in the research game for the majority of my own work career, I am quite aware that the volume and the acceleration of climate change research is in fact phenomenal. There are large bodies of work that have been completed, even larger bodies of work that are being planned. And the problem is a classical and cliche one. And that is there's a void, a chasm between what the scientists are able to produce, and you have many frustrated scientists in the world saying that, you know, we're simply not being listened to. And then you have the decision makers on the other side, if you like, society, they're saying that, well, you say you're not being heard, and we say we're not being served because frankly, we don't know what you're saying. And so building the right kind of bridges around that, and it's not about simplifying the language. It's something that scientists often say, and I think it's very silly to say. I think you have to up the game on being better at communication. And making very intimately the connections between the scientific phenomenon and how it affects the things that those decision makers think that are high priority for them. So I'll give you an example of something that I think is working with the World Economic Forum and around how it organizes to compile its risk register, and finding that boardrooms are paying a lot more attention to that for two reasons. One is written in a way that boardrooms generally have their discussion. And two, it comes from an authority base that they will listen to. You know, while everybody respects the professors in the universities, they're the easiest people to ignore. And so building that bridge becomes really important. So this policy report that the IPCC put out as part of the 6th assessment report, the first working group report, is really, really important. Except if you look at that policy, that report for policymakers, it's really hard to read. And you don't even have to be a policymaker to know how hard that is to read. So we do need to bridge that. The second thing that I think is critically important is to engage the people that decision makers cannot ignore. And this is around creating agency in the different lobby groups that constitutes the broadness of society. And this is about influencing what the business lobby thinks and what the civil society lobby and the environmental activists think, and so forth and so on, in a way that connects up the dots and the conversation. So in the South African environment, the experiment we're currently busy with now is this thing called the Presidential Climate Commission, which I'm a part of. And the Presidential Climate Commission is essentially a social compact. It is bringing together these different stakeholder groups and combining them in a conversation around the impact of climate change. And we've already seen some really good results. One of those is that we have an updated NDC that is finally, for a large emitting country, finally within the Paris Agreement. This came on the back of the intervention of the PCC. We now have introduced a just transition framework to guide our transition from a high carbon economy to a low carbon economy, which will make it much more accessible for the different decision makers and lobbyists inside the system. So that's my contribution. Is more research required? A lot more research is required. It always is. But one also needs to put the emphasis around how to join up the dots so that the knowledge is easily accessible to the people who are at any point in time being lobbied and bombarded by lobbyists from lots of different directions. And do not underestimate the fossil fuel value chain, because they continue to be enormously powerful.
Thanks a ton. So I just see that we have a question from the audience from Anne Moissin. Cascading and compounding risks has been a theme in programs I run with North Africans, and find denial and the inability to deal with challenges that that cross ministries is a real issue. Any suggestions?
Can I respond?
Sorry?
I can take that if you like.
Please, yes.
Okay, look, yes, it is a difficulty, and it's a particular difficulty in areas like North Africa and also other pockets on our continent that are in fact fossil fuel rich and sit on a fossil fuel asset. And that becomes an important dilemma inside the system. But, and the but is really important, all of these countries are also beginning to now recognize that things like CBAMs and future trade barriers are a very real constraint on their ability to develop further. And you'll see that very big investments are being made in renewable energies in exactly those countries, like Morocco as one example. Egypt is another example. And I would not underestimate, and perhaps I'm being optimistic here, I would not underestimate what the impact can be of this COP27. Because this COP27 is now pitching and heightening a discussion on the continent like it's never had before, around seeing the opportunities of a low carbon economy and what that can mean around development. And the Egyptian presidency says it's looking at COP27, in their words, as a transformative moment in climate action. They are also talking about other parts of the world upping their partnership naturally, but it's also talking about the momentum that would happen internally. So I'm hopeful, and that this is that transformative moment that gives us a new step up in the way we engage the climate debate on the continent.
Thanks a ton. I think in the interest of time, I would like to move to the final part of our panel discussion. And I would like to invite all of the three panelists to share their final statements on the ways forward. So the question is, going forward, what is needed to place the topic of cascading and compounding risks more prominently on the scientific and political agendas to prepare for such worst-case scenarios? What collaborations and partnerships and activities are required, and who should be involved? And I would like to start by an input, let's say now by Franziska.
Sure. Yeah, again, I think I would argue for a greater focus on complexity of risk and potentially ignored impacts due to systemic risk like nonlinear cascade interdependencies, rather than starting with the premise that the risk has to be catastrophic. And I think for this, we need transdisciplinary approaches that really bring together, as Desigan has mentioned, academics, policymakers, but also civil society. And I think to explore together how we can prepare for those unexpected, maybe even catastrophic events, it's really, really important to work together. And I think maybe just coming back to the comment by Desigan on how to bridge the science policy gap, I think this is also for us researchers really a key topic, and we have a lot of controversial discussion around that, because on the one hand side, we have to be neutral. Our job is to just provide information. But then the question is, it doesn't reach the policymakers. So how and how far are we allowed to become lobbyists and approach the policymakers? So I think this is for sure an interesting debate, and yeah, that will be continued.
Thank you, Franziska. Desigan, would you like to also share your final statement with us?
Indeed. Look, I think that organizing for ourselves to have a much more sophisticated analysis around the compounding and cascading impacts is the way to prioritize this for decision makers. And let me point out that we're all decision makers. It's just about the levels of decision making that change. The second thing I'm going to put into that part is that I mean, I was a little bit critical about Luke, but the reality is that most of my own presentations at different conferences started exactly with that caricature about this is how bad it can be. It's kind of like the wake up, and you're sure that everyone is now listening to you in the audience. I think it's an important starting point. But then you have to quickly move to the more plausible stories that make it practical for people to adhere to. And so the idea around developing out multiple scenarios where the most catastrophic is only one of them is, I think, a very useful way to go. And it is in fact what the ISS is planning to do in 2023 for the African continent. And we would really like to have as wide a partnership in this exercise as possible, because I think it's going to be good for everybody, not just for Africans. And the third thing is that we have to get the equations right. I mean, I think we have to get into the meat and potatoes, if you like, of organizing for the practical instruments that become the expression of policy. So the things that government folk would be familiar with, for example, is developing out budget options for different policy decisions, really become important. Then you have a complete set of things that you can use. And if there's a buy-in, then it's packaged and ready to actually move into the system. But it also means you have to convince a whole number of people to be part of this really expanded team that is genuinely required. And the very last point is that we've come to a point where our North-South relationship around issues like climate change, around issues like biodiversity and the environment really needs to change. It has to become a lot more collegial as opposed to preachy. And we have to recognize that we are indeed all part of one global team that will make this difference. Thank you.
I would like to quickly ask about the last point about the North-South divide, and that it needs to become more collegial. Have you already witnessed some progress in this direction?
Not enough.
Not enough.
In fact, far from enough. I mean, for example, although we have these kinds of conversations, if you then move into the space of investment, 90% of the funds is available only for mitigation activities, when it's quite clear that what most of the developing world currently requires is an ability to survive in a plus 1.2 degrees Celsius world, because that's where we're already at. So moving the balance to adaptation funding is something that's an indicator that we're far away from where we need to be.
Thank you. Thanks a ton. And last but not least, Nina, could you share your closing remarks with us?
Sure. First of all, I would like to echo two points. I mean, one is, of course, the inclusive debate we should be having, both in terms of disciplines, but also in terms of where research is coming from. And I think this I agree that there's not enough of that, but also on the research front, where I think there's a lot of this debate happening among researchers. I mean, this is maybe very good examples where we discuss these issues on Zoom, which is also a nice way of connecting without creating greater climate costs. Then for the top front, for how to move forward, I would like to emphasize that I think we should not only talk about the extreme climate change scenarios, but we also need to have a look into the underlying vulnerability scenarios for that. So if we look into the shared socioeconomic pathways that underlie a lot of the research that is done on climate change impact assessments, I think there is a lot that needs to be said about them, and not a lot that needs to be expanded. So, for example, that the global South scenarios on GDP, and as colleagues have shown, Halvard Buhaug and Jonas Vesby, are far too optimistic in terms of growth, meaning that climate change impacts will be vastly underestimated. So I do think with more research we can point to these developments, both in terms of incorporating the extreme climate event, but also in terms of creating a more suitable and more realistic set of scenarios for developments that are relevant for conflict, but also relevant for vulnerability as we move forward. And then I think the idea that was also mentioned in the report about an IPCC report in a well-communicated language on extreme climate change scenarios may be a good idea to bring together researchers on the topic eventually, and to put forward a report on that, because it really seems to be the case that there is little out there, and that there's really a need for interdisciplinary and more communication on that topic. Thanks.
Thanks a ton. So I think this brings me to the end of our session. So I see that there are no questions from the audience. I would still like to invite the audience to ask questions, or to invite the panelists if they want to ask questions to each other. Please let me know. But so far I see no, then I think I might directly conclude, because we have only 4 minutes left, or 3 minutes left. So we have heard a lot of interesting inputs on why we need to focus and why we shouldn't focus on the extreme climate change scenarios. So we have heard different perspectives on this, basically everyone agrees that focusing actually on systemic risks, on compounding risks and cascading risks should be one of our priorities, as this can have very productive implications for debates in the policy. It can bring the relevant stakeholders on board. So why haven't we progressed in this direction so far that much, or as much as we wanted to, is because there is still a lot of technical and data challenges in terms of assessing these risks, as it turns out to be much simpler to focus on one of the drivers of conflict, or one of the drivers of security risks, rather than looking them in interactions. So I think these aspects is something that we can, or this kind of like research agenda, or point on the research agenda, is something that we can think about now, how to address this in a better way. But there is also some progress in this direction that we have seen across disciplines. So in the food system research, there is a shift towards a larger focus on systemic risks, while in the climate security research, there hasn't been that much progress so far. What could help us is more interdisciplinary work, more building bridges between different sectors, between different disciplines. And if we want to translate the knowledge that has been so far produced into efficient policymaking, one of the important elements is the translation of knowledge, because sometimes as scientists, we speak very technically, and I think communication and improvement of communication and building bridges between science and policy is a very promising way forward. These are my last words. If I missed something important, please let me know, or feel free to step in. And these are not my last words, but only last words within this session. Thank you again for your great participation. Yeah. And I think we can slowly close the session. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for organizing.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting debate.